My name is Samuel. I'm 82 years old. For most of my life, I read my Bible the way most people do. I read the stories they taught us in Sunday school, and I never questioned the parts they skipped over. But 11 years ago, I found something in the book of Numbers that contradicted everything I had been told about the flood. Something that should not exist in the text if the story I learned as a child was complete. The Nephilim were supposed to be dead. The flood was supposed to have destroyed them all, every last one. And yet there they were, walking in Canaan 1,000 years later, named by the same Hebrew word, described by 12 spies who saw them with their own eyes. I spent the next decade pulling on that thread, and what unraveled changed everything I understood about the Bible, about the ancient world, and about the time we are living in right now. Let me tell you what I found. It started with a single verse. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. 18 words in Hebrew that mention the Nephilim, and then the Bible goes silent for 40 generations. 40 generations without that name appearing again. I had read past that verse hundreds of times without stopping. You see, most people do. They read Genesis 6, they hear about giants, they nod along, and they move on to Noah and the animals going 2 by 2. That's the safe version. That's the children's version. But there is another version buried in the same text, and it is not safe at all. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. Literally it translates as the fallen ones. Not just tall humans, not just warriors, beings whose origin was something other than natural. Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 gives the context. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives for themselves. From that union came the Nephilim, the mighty ones, the men of renown from ancient times. The sons of God. That phrase appears only 5 times in the entire Old Testament. In Job chapter 1, Job chapter 2, Job chapter 38. Every time it refers specifically to angelic beings, not pious humans, not the line of Seth, as some theologians suggest, angels. But here is what Genesis does not tell you. It does not reveal their names. It does not explain how they descended. It does not detail what they taught humanity. It summarizes in 4 verses what must have been centuries of progressive corruption. It gives you the verdict without the trial. And that is where the Book of Enoch fills in the blanks. I didn't read the Book of Enoch until I was 73 years old. Nobody in my church ever mentioned it. But it was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is quoted directly in the letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15. The early church fathers knew it well, and what it describes made my blood run cold. 200 angels called the Watchers descended to Mount Hermon, that specific mountain on the border of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Its name in Hebrew comes from the root haram, meaning consecrated or devoted to destruction. They swore a binding pact among themselves. Their leader was called Semyaza. They took human wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. Others taught sorcery, astrology, the reading of clouds and stars. It was not a simple sin of lust. It was a cosmic conspiracy to alter the order of creation itself. From those unions came the Nephilim, giants with supernatural strength and insatiable appetites. They consumed all the food of the earth. When there was not enough, they turned on the animals. When the animals were not enough, they turned on humanity. The violence mentioned in Genesis 6 was not metaphorical. It was literal. It was cannibalism. It was a nightmare where angel-human hybrids hunted normal humans like cattle. Honestly, when I first read those passages, I sat in my chair and I didn't move for a long time. I felt afraid. Not of the text, of what it meant, of what it implied about the world I was living in. But I kept reading. God looked at the earth and saw that it was lost. The Hebrew word for corrupted in Genesis 6 verse 12 is shakath. It means ruined, spoiled, destroyed. It describes physical damage, not just spiritual sin. And the text says all flesh had corrupted its way. Not all people, all flesh, DNA, genetics, biology. The corruption was not reversible through gradual reform. It was terminal. The only option was total reset. And here's what I didn't understand then. The reason God chose Noah was not simply because Noah was a good man. Genesis 6 verse 9 says Noah was perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word for perfect is tamim. In other biblical contexts, it describes sacrificial animals that must be without physical defect, without blemish, without corruption. It refers to genetic purity. Noah and his family were the last humans whose DNA had not been contaminated by the angelic hybridization. That is why they were selected. That is why 8 people entered the ark. That is why everything else had to be destroyed. The flood came. The fountains of the great deep broke open. The windows of heaven were unleashed. 40 days and 40 nights of rain, unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The waters prevailed for 150 days. Every living thing that breathed air was wiped from the face of the earth. Genesis 7 verse 23 does not leave room for interpretation. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those with him in the ark remained alive. Only. That word is absolute. 8 people came out of that ark. 8 people to repopulate an entire planet. The earth received a second chance. The corruption was gone. The Nephilim were dead. The watchers were chained in darkness. The nightmare was over. Except it wasn't. Let me explain. Jump with me now to Numbers chapter 13. 1,000 years have passed. Israel has come out of Egypt. They are camped in the wilderness of Paran. Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan to scout the promised land. 40 days of reconnaissance. They come back carrying a cluster of grapes so large it takes 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. The land is everything God promised, fertile, abundant, flowing with milk and honey. But then comes the report that breaks Israel completely. Numbers 13 verse 33. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. I need you to stop here and read that again carefully. The spies used that specific word, Nephilim, the exact same Hebrew word from Genesis 6. They did not say these people were like giants. They did not say they resembled the ancient ones. They said they were Nephilim, and they specified the lineage. Descendants of Anak. The Hebrew word for descendants is toledot, meaning generations, genealogical line. These were not randomly tall humans. They were the direct progeny of beings that should have been completely annihilated by the flood 1,000 years earlier. And yet there they were, walking, breathing, living in fortified cities in the land God had promised to Abraham. You know what surprised me most? The reaction of Israel. These were men who had seen God divide the Red Sea. They had witnessed the plagues of Egypt. They had eaten manna from heaven for 40 years. They had seen the pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day. They were trained warriors fresh from 400 years of endurance in the most powerful nation on earth. And the report of the Nephilim broke them completely. They wept all night, not from cowardice, from existential terror, because they knew exactly what that name meant. They knew the stories their fathers had told them about the world before the flood. Now here is the question that kept me awake for months. If only Noah and his family survived the flood, if Noah was genetically pure, if the entire purpose of the flood was to eliminate the genetic corruption caused by the Watchers and their Nephilim offspring, then how is it possible that 1,000 years later the Nephilim exist again in Canaan? There are only 3 possible explanations. First, there was a second incursion of fallen angels after the flood, who repeated the original transgression. Second, something in the human genetics that came off the ark carried latent information that resurfaced under certain conditions. Third, the wife of one of Noah's sons was not genetically pure. The first theory has limited biblical support. Jude verse 6 describes the punishment of the original Watchers as so severe that it served as a permanent warning. 200 angels chained in darkness forever. What angel would repeat that knowing the consequences? Possible, but unlikely on that scale. The second theory contradicts the declaration that Noah was tamim, genetically pure in his generations. If Noah and his 3 sons were pure, the only possible vectors for contaminated genes would be the wives. And that is where the third theory becomes not just possible, but probable. Especially when you look at what happened after the flood. Genesis chapter 9. Noah gets drunk and lies uncovered in his tent. Ham sees his father's nakedness. When Noah wakes up, he does not curse Ham. He curses Canaan, Ham's son. Why punish the grandson for the father's sin? Why specifically Canaan and not Ham's other sons? The Hebrew word used in that passage for what Ham did carries implications that go beyond simply looking. Some Hebrew scholars suggest that whatever happened affected the genetic line, that something entered the ark that should not have been there, something in Ham's wife, something in the line of Canaan. And here is what confirmed it for me. When you read the genealogy of Canaan in Genesis chapter 10, you find the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, all the nations that Israel would find in Canaan, all connected genealogically through Ham. And then in Genesis 10 verse 8, Nimrod appears, son of Cush, grandson of Ham, a mighty one on the earth. The Hebrew word for mighty is Gibor, the singular of Gibborim, the exact same term used for the Nephilim in Genesis 6. Nimrod built Babel. He was the first empire builder after the flood, the first tyrant. God gave Israel very specific instructions about what to do with these nations. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Destroy them totally. Men, women, children, animals, no exceptions, no prisoners, no mercy. The Hebrew word is kerem, complete dedication to destruction. Those were not normal terms of ancient warfare. Normally you took slaves and integrated the conquered, but not with these 7 nations. With them, the order was absolute extermination. I was scared when I understood why, because it was not arbitrary genocide. It was the continuation of what the flood began but did not complete. It was the surgical elimination of genetic lines that should not exist, lines that carried the heritage of the fallen ones, peoples whose very existence represented a threat to God's redemptive plan for humanity. And then I found the verse that tied everything together, Genesis 6 verse 4, a phrase that almost nobody notices. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Also afterward. 2 words. That is the key. Because they mean that what comes after the flood is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next chapter. The evidence is not only textual. I spent years reading about the physical evidence that remains. Baalbek in Lebanon with stone blocks weighing over 1,000 tons each. Pumapumku in Bolivia with cuts in diorite stone so precise they look machine-made. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 11,600 years old, deliberately buried under tons of earth and rubble. The elongated skulls of Paracas in Peru, with mitochondrial DNA that matches no known human population, and cranial capacity 25% larger than average. Reports from around the world over the last 300 years documenting skeletal remains of impossible size. Over 200 separate cultures across every continent sharing the same basic narrative. Giants with supernatural knowledge, forbidden teachings, massive corruption, global flood, few survivors. These are not independent fables that coincidentally match. They are fragmented memories of the same real event, seen through different cultural lenses. And here is where everything escalates. Because this is not just ancient history. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 through 39, "As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man." Most people read that and think he was talking about people living carelessly, eating and drinking without spiritual preparation. That interpretation is not wrong, but it is shallow. It is the tip of the iceberg. The days of Noah were marked by genetic hybrids walking the earth, by fallen angels revealing forbidden knowledge, by manipulation of creation at the fundamental level, by corruption of all flesh, by technology in the hands of a morally corrupt civilization. Those were the conditions, and Jesus said that is what it will be like before his return. Not similar, not resembling, as it was, identical in nature. Now look around. In 2012, scientists discovered CRISPR-Cas9, a technology that allows editing the DNA of any living organism with surgical precision. In 2018, a scientist in China created the first genetically modified human babies. In 2017, researchers created the first human-pig hybrid embryo. In 2019, Japan approved creating human-animal hybrids and carrying them to full term. Elon Musk's Neuralink installed its first human brain implant in January 2024, with the explicit goal of merging human brains with computers. We are doing exactly what the Watchers taught the antediluvian world. We are crossing barriers that God established in creation. I am 82 years old. I have watched this unfold over the last decade with my own eyes. The explosion of interest in the occult, channelers claiming to communicate with beings from other dimensions, ayahuasca ceremonies presented as spiritual growth, abduction accounts reported by tens of thousands of people with narratives that are disturbingly consistent. Encounters with entities that give advanced knowledge, that perform invasive procedures, that manipulate human genetics. They are the same patterns Enoch recorded about the Watchers. We just call them extraterrestrials now instead of fallen angels. We changed the language. The phenomenon is identical. Jesus said in Matthew 24 verse 22 that if those days were not cut short, no one would survive. Why? Because if the genetic corruption reaches the same level it reached in the days of Noah, there would be no genetically pure humans left, no true humans at all, only hybrids. And God's redemptive plan requires humans to save. That is why the days will be shortened. That is why Christ's return must happen before the corruption reaches the point of no return. Noah preached righteousness for 120 years. Nobody listened except his immediate family. The world kept eating, drinking, marrying, living as if tomorrow was guaranteed. Until one day the windows of heaven opened and it was too late. The door of the ark closed, not by Noah's hand. Genesis 7 verse 16 says the Lord shut him in. God himself sealed the entrance. And outside, the world that had rejected the warning drowned in the judgment they could have avoided. I felt empty when I finished this study, not because the knowledge was depressing, because I realized I had wasted decades reading the surface of the text without seeing what was underneath. The Nephilim were not a footnote. They were not a myth that slipped into the narrative. They were the reason for the flood. And their return after the flood was the reason for the conquest of Canaan. And the conditions that produced them are the exact conditions Jesus said would mark the end of this age. If this opened your eyes the way it opened mine, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment and tell me what part of this you were never taught. Tell me which connection you had never seen before. Subscribe to this channel because there are threads running through scripture that nobody talks about, and I intend to keep pulling on them until the whole pattern is visible. Hit the like button so this reaches someone who needs to hear it. Share it with the person you know who reads their Bible but has never been shown what is underneath the Sunday school version. Because the days of Noah have returned. The question is not whether the cycle will repeat. Jesus already confirmed it will. The question is whether you will be ready when it does. I'm Samuel. I'm 82 years old, and I am telling you what I found.